Today we're installing window trim around these tall, beautiful windows. Typically, installing window trim is very easy for even the novice do-it-yourselfer, so we're going to focus on the elements of this project that are a little more advanced. About 75% of our time on the project will be devoted to these arches. We're going to do some magic a little later to bend our pieces to shape, so stay tuned. But first, let's focus on what we want the molding on the windows to look like. Our spacing between the windows is very narrow. In fact, we have just over 3 inches to work with between the radius of the corners. That's pretty small and doesn't allow us to use a large enough molding to do justice to these big windows. So here's a little trick that will not only give us more room to work with, but will also make these windows really pop. Instead of just using a single piece of molding and installing it up to the radius on the wall, we're going to use a second molding along the inside of the window. Now, instead of having 3 inches to work with, we have just a little bit over 5 inches. And we can use 2 pieces of 2.5 inch molding back to back. We'll start by installing around the inner portion of our windows. Our top arch has a pretty tight radius, so we need our material to be flexible enough to bend around it. Let's try MDF. As you can see, MDF is not very flexible, and it would be nearly impossible for us to bend it to shape around the arch. So we're using polyurethane. It's a perfect material for this project because of its flexibility. With this piece, we can form it to the shape of the arch. And then, when we install, we just add some adhesive on the back and nail it into place. For the remainder of the inner pieces, the only angles we need to cut are for the bottom 2 90-degree corners. If you have a compound miter saw, you can lay your pieces flat on the saw and use the 45-degree bevel angle. If you just have a standard miter saw, you can position your pieces up against the fence and use the 45-degree miter angle. We've finished the inner portion of the windows, so let's revisit our discussion about the arches at the top of our windows. Our polyurethane molding is very flexible in this direction because it's less than 1 inch thick, but it's much less flexible when we try to bend it in this direction. In order to make this piece flexible enough to bend around these windows, we're going to cut it using a table saw. By splitting it into 2 thinner pieces, we can bend it considerably more than the original piece. You know, I can almost hear all the contractors out there shouting at the screen, "What about that 1/8 of an inch you lost due to the thickness of the saw blade?" Well, let's go outside and take a look at how to handle that. When we run the piece through the saw, we do in fact lose part of the width equal to the thickness of the saw blade. If cut at the right spot, you can still get decent results by just using a small spacer and then fill the gap with spackling. You can get perfect results, however, using 2 lengths of molding that, when cut, recreate a piece that is the same thickness as our original molding. Here's how you do it. Find a spot on the molding that will be the least noticeable when you piece it back together. Put a thin pencil mark in the same spot on both pieces. On one piece, shade to the left of the mark, and on the other piece, shade to the right of the mark. When you run your molding through the saw, you'll cut through the shaded portion right up to your pencil mark. You now have 2 pieces that are flexible enough to bend, but still fit together like the original piece. Flexible, yes, but when dealing with an arch that has an extremely tight radius like this one, it's a lot more challenging. Most window arches have a milder radius that our molding will easily flex around. But this 16-inch radius is a different ballgame altogether. The outer piece is flexible enough to go around the arch, but the inner piece needs some work. So let's go over some methods for further increasing the flexibility of the molding. One option is to use a heat gun. As the polyurethane heats, it's easier to bend without breaking. Another option is to use a coping saw to make cuts every 3/4 of an inch along the inner portion of the molding. This is easy to do, and with a little bit of finish work, it will look great. Okay, our windows are completed. The caulking, the painting. Now let's step back and go a little bit deeper into some of the finer details of this project. If you're installing around nice windows that don't have shutters or blinds, I recommend adding inner molding. They add extra width and really look fantastic, especially on larger windows. Now, when selecting your inner trim, measure the distance that your window is set back from the wall. Typically, you should select a trim that's the same size or shorter than this measurement. But you can also pick a wider molding and then run it through your table saw to trim it to the correct width. Your cut won't be seen since it'll be covered by the window framework. If you have a radius on your windows like we have, be sure to bring the inner molding out beyond the radius to where the outer molding can sit flat against it. For this type of project, you should paint the molding that will be installed on the inner portion of the windows prior to installation. If you don't, you'll need to tape off each window and it'll just be a lot of extra work. For the outer trim, it's best to paint it after you've caulked all the seams and filled the holes. While polyurethane moldings are very flexible, they can still break if being bent around a tight radius like in our project. There are several things you can do to prepare your pieces for bending around the inside of the window. Try bending your pieces in advance by putting them up against a wall. You can even place a bit of weight on them. The material becomes more flexible when warm, more prone to break when cold. So if your molding has been sitting outside in cold weather, try heating it up with a hairdryer prior to extensive bending. The molding we used in this project was only 2.5 inches wide, but the same method of splitting the molding to bend around an arch will work for much wider moldings as well. All you need to do is split the molding into more pieces. Now remember, we do lose 1/8 of an inch from the saw blade when cutting, but it still only takes 2 pieces of molding to recreate a full-size piece. That's it for our project today. For complete step-by-step videos on a variety of projects or to purchase the perfect moldings for your home, visit uDecor.com.